Started here in just a couple of minutes. Here in the Daily Planet Theater, grab a seat. You can join us on the first, second, or third floors here inside the Globe. We'd love to have you. We're going to meet some fascinating, fabulous scientists who work here at the Museum of Natural Sciences. They'll be sharing their stories working with endangered species in North Carolina and around the world. Our presentations will get started in just a couple of minutes. That's right, everybody. We're going to get started in just a moment. Join us for Endangered Species Day, today, May 17th. We're going to hear from exciting scientists doing exciting science. That's happening here inside the Globe. Join us in the center of the Earth. We're going to get started in just 1 minute. All right, everybody, let's get started. Good morning, folks. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Today is the third Friday in May, and for the last several years, this day has been designated as Endangered Species Day. Thank you so much for coming out to the museum for this special day. My name is Chris Smith. I work in education here at the museum. I'll be your host for today's Endangered Species Day presentations and discussion. And I was thinking about today, and it's always difficult when you see these sort of like social media holidays or these days that have been created like this. It's tempting to say like, well, happy Endangered Species Day. But I don't know if today is always or should always be thought of as like the happiest day. It is a great opportunity to celebrate species that are threatened and endangered, that are on the brink, as well as to hear stories of wildlife that has been brought back from the brink. So maybe not Happy Endangered Species Day, but certainly we are here to celebrate endangered species, learn about them, hear about actions that are going on worldwide in order to improve the situation globally for endangered species, wildlife on the brink, and also, at least today, here in the SCCU Daily Planet Theater, we're going to meet some interesting people who are doing interesting work in the world of science and nature and conservation, who are doing that work here in North Carolina, in our own backyards, and around the world. This day was originally created back in 2006, as I understand it, in order to bring attention and light to the Endangered Species Act, right? Legislation that was passed in the early 1970s to actually give support to endangered species, mostly here in the United States. But, of course, we know that there are wildlife ecosystems around the world that need help and support. So, today we're going to be hearing from 5 scientists who work here at the museum. They're going to deliver short presentations about some of the species that they've worked with and continue to do work and research with, again, in North Carolina, but also around the world. After they've delivered their presentations, we'll all come up on stage and have just a quick conversation where we can sort of talk about some of the big picture ideas that are going on in conservation worldwide. So, in order to get started, let me introduce you to your first guest. He's the head of the Biodiversity Research Lab here at the Museum of Natural Sciences, and he's a professor at NC State University, and he has appointments and jobs and directorships and all sorts of other things. You might know Dr. Roland Kays from his book Candid Critters. He also is like one of the world's experts in animal tracking using camera traps. Very excited to have Roland share with us today. Please put your hands together and welcome to the stage Dr. Roland Kays.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody. Well, thanks for coming today. So I'm going to talk about wolves today, and we're starting a long, long time ago when we don't even really know much about the wolves, the original wolves that were in North Carolina. This is a famous book by one of the first Europeans that explored the wilds of North Carolina, and he said up there, the wolf is the dog of the woods. They are neither so large nor fierce as the European wolf. They are not manslayers. They go in great droves in the night to hunt deer, which that all sounds pretty good. But then you never know these early explorers. Then he said, when they can catch no prey, they go into the swamp and fill their belly full of mud. No one does that, right? But this is what he said. And then if afterwards they, by chance, catch anything of flesh, they will disgorge the mud and eat the other. Okay, they probably didn't do that. But this just kind of shows how little we actually know about the original wolves that were in North Carolina. Here's another illustration of one of those early wolves. But what we do have is museum specimens. So we know there were wolves here because in our collections, we have these really old bits and parts of them. We have skulls, we have mandibles. This is one that was poisoned, and you can kind of see his snarled up nose like he probably wishes he hadn't eaten that last thing. And we also have some amazing, this is a archaeological remain of a wolf hand puppet. The mouth is wolf, and the hair is actually deer, and the shell eyes. So we have these evidence. We know there were wolves here in North Carolina originally and elsewhere in the east, right? But then European colonists came over, and they chopped down a lot of trees. They destroyed a lot of the habitat, logged the forests, And this is not a good place for wolves to live, right? They also did a lot of hunting. There were basically no conservation laws. You could go out and shoot as many deer as you wanted to and sell them and make money. And this didn't go very well for the wildlife, right? The deer population crashed, and the wolves were really, in particular, prosecuted. They really hated the wolves. Even John James Audubon, one of the earliest guys that we think about as someone who was important for conservation, he went and killed some wolves in Ohio. So, really, we didn't know our early wolves very well, but we certainly didn't like them. And so the population really declined, and this is the range map of where we think originally gray wolves and red wolves lived, right? So on the red side in the southeast, we had the red wolf, and the rest of the country, they had the gray wolf, pretty much everywhere, right? But by 1960s, 1970s, I don't even know if you guys can see where they remained. There was only a few wolves in the lower 48 states living up in Minnesota, and then some in the sort of Louisiana, Texas coast. This was how bad it got. We had killed wolves everywhere else. But then we started to change a little bit how we feel about wolves. So this is Aldo Leopold, one of the first conservationists who really saw the value of wolves, and he killed a wolf when he was a young man. And he said, when we reached the old wolf in time to watch, a fierce green fire was dying in her eyes. I realized then, and have known ever since, that there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her and the mountain. He said, I was young then and full of trigger itch. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean a hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. So this is us starting to realize that maybe wolves aren't so bad. Maybe we shouldn't try to drive wolves to extinction. Maybe we should try to save them. And they were one of the first species protected by the Endangered Species Act. They were famously reintroduced into Yellowstone in the 1990s, and also into North Carolina, the red wolf in the 70s. In 87. They brought them into captivity. They released them into eastern North Carolina. Here you can see where they released the red wolves. And their population initially did pretty well. It increased up. They had pretty stable pairs. And in the West, also, the wolves have now spread across the western United States. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, but there's another canid in the same, related to wolves, and that's called the coyote, that you guys probably know about. And the coyote, compared to the wolves, is doing great. They do really well around people, and we haven't been able to drive them out. And they've actually spread
across North America, from Alaska to Panama.
There's a little audio here.
But
Can we get
where
this
they
turned up?
came from and how they got there has long been debated. Using museum specimens, researchers have created a comprehensive range history of the species.
That's inside our museum.
The fossils
That's
and
where we were
skulls they
looking at the
found
specimens.
show a stable coyote range from 10,000 years ago to about 1900. Range expansion began in the early 1900s. By the 1920s, the coyotes had arrived in Alaska. And by the 1990s, they had covered most of the East Coast. Expansion was likely aided by agriculture and forest fragmentation, and hybridization with dogs and wolves resulted in size and color variation. Today, coyotes are expanding their range in Central America, crossing the Panama Canal in 2010. Camera traps are now spotting the coyotes moving towards the densely forested region separating Central and South America. Will the forest halt coyote expansion, or will they continue to South America? Scientists and their camera traps will be waiting to see.
So coyotes have moved in, and coyotes and red wolves don't get along. There's some problems. First is hunters want to kill coyotes, and it's pretty hard to tell them from a red wolf. So sometimes they kill the red wolves instead. And also, the coyotes and the red wolves will breed together. They can breed together, and so that's diluting the wolf gene pool. And as a result, after coyotes moved into this area, the red wolf population started to decline. A lot of them got shot by local hunters, or also there's some problems getting hit by cars. And so the red wolf population in North Carolina more recently has started to decline after being pretty stable. By 2023, last year, there was only about 10 animals left in the red wolf area. You can see the wolves in the rest of the United States, they're actually doing pretty well. So the gray wolf is now no longer listed as an endangered species in some part of its range, but the red wolf still is. I'm going to skip this part. For the last couple years, they've been releasing more animals, and finally, they had, in 2022, they had the first litter. They hadn't bred in North Carolina in quite a few years, and they had a litter finally, which was great, and now these red wolves are still running around, and 4 of them are still alive. 4 of these 6 animals. 1 of them got hit by a car, and the other one they're not sure about, but now we know that 4 of these. So hopefully, this will be the next generation of red wolves in North Carolina. The population, as of April of this year, there are at least 17 collar, they think 18 to 20 total. And you can see there's a lot more animals in captivity. So there's some animals in the North Carolina Zoo, in the Durham Museum of Life and Sciences, and other zoos around the country that they can still release to try to keep the red wolves going in the wild. So that's the update on wolves. Now you know that in the Western United States, the Endangered Species Act has really worked. They're doing a lot better. There's still a lot of controversy around them, but their populations are doing pretty well. In North Carolina and other parts of the east, the red wolf is still struggling, and so it still needs our help. It's still listed as an endangered species, but there is still hope for the future. So that's the end of wolves, and I can pass the mic on to Chris, or should I just, yes, okay, great. So I think we'll take questions later, right?
Yeah, we'll take questions at the end of the presentations. So stick around if you've got questions. I'm sure that you do. Let's give Roland a round of applause.
Thanks, everybody.
Next up, I want everybody to meet Dr. Liz Korupka. Dr. Korupka is a conservation geneticist and a research scientist with the Museum of Natural Sciences and North Carolina State University, where she's also an assistant research professor. And I believe we're going to hear about black rhinos, but Dr. Korupka has done work in the U.S. with endangered species, cool animals like badgers, but also gorillas, and I'm very excited to learn about rhinoceroses. Thank you. Dr. Korupka, take it away.
All right, so I guess we're going to completely switch gears away from our North American guys and talk about one of, hopefully most people know what a rhinoceros is, but they are one of 5 species that are alive across the world in both Asia and Africa, but I'm going to be talking about our critically endangered African representative. And so black rhinos, this is a typical individual that you can see here. What they are most known for is that horn on their head. So they're actually thought to be unicorns back before they were actually formalized. And so their horns were actually sold as unicorn horns for a little bit. And so these guys are a very, very large animal. You're talking 1,500 to 3,000 pounds. So this is an animal that if it decides to charge your car is not going to be doing very well. So they are... inhabit sort of these sub-Saharan African areas. So if you watch a nature documentary where they're looking at, the Africa savanna, things like that, that's the type of habitat they tend to really live. And so those habitats have undergone a lot of conversion over the years. And so that's what one of the major threats for these guys is they're losing those habitats. And so for these guys, there are 4 different types of black rhinos throughout Africa that you can see here. Basically, they're according to their geographic location. The one I work with personally is the South Central species, which is found in South Africa and Zimbabwe. And that these guys were doing quite well. They were once the most common rhino species in the world by far. Fossil records show them all throughout these countries in Africa. This map represents about 1960, where in 1960 they had lost some of that habitat, sort of, you see that blank spot in Eastern Africa, but they were still doing fairly well. There were about 100,000 animals left, which doesn't qualify for the Endangered Species Act. But then something happened in the 1960s. And what happened in the 1960s was poaching. So rhino's horn is one of the most lucrative items you can get in the wildlife trade. East Asia is the primary target for these horns. They're used for many different things in traditional medicine. And because of that, the demand for rhino horn skyrocketed. And what happened is that you can't remove a rhino horn very well unless you have a vet and all of those things. So their population numbers absolutely catapulted down. They lost about 98% of their population within 30 years. So this went from, to give you an idea, the entire population went from 100,000 animals all the way down to 2,200. So when that happened, they were listed as critically endangered, and there then began this very intensive conservation program, which I'm going to really talk about with my focal population, but this is very similar across many others. And so one of the first things, again, is they were listed as critically endangered, but really the challenges with black rhinos is that unlike some species that can breed their first year, these guys, it can take 6 to 15 years before they're even ready to breed. So it takes decades for these guys to recover. So even if they are breeding really well one year, just one generation of poaching can take them right back down. And so that has happened several times in multiple different locations. And so really the focus is keeping these animals alive as well as figuring out where they can put them. And so from that, now this is their current range map, and so you can see there's 3 different colors on that map. One, there's this sort of brown gold color, that's where our stronghold populations are. These are populations that did not experience extinction, and they are what we call source populations for all the rest. That green is where they've been reintroduced, and so they were removed from those populations during the 60s through the 80s, and then now that these stronghold populations have gotten big enough, they've been able to reintroduce them back to these areas. They've basically been lost in the northern part of the range, but I'll show you that that might be changing in the future. And so really the focus of conservation within rhinos focuses on 2 things. 1, moving rhinos around, and 2, removing those horns before poachers can get them. And so just to show you how moving goes, so it's exactly what you would picture. Again, you're talking about a 1,500 to 3,000 pound animal, and they are known for charge first, ask questions later. They are not, you can't go up and pet them. They are, so you usually have to use a lot of different gears and teams of people to move these animals around. So you can actually see these pictures are from the 2018 release in Malawi, where some of the time one of the most effective ways to move these guys is to actually hook them to an airplane and actually airlift them to a new area. And so they are asleep during this, so they are not stressed out, or they are put into these large sort of horse trailers and driven to their new areas. And so there are really a lot of benefits to doing this. One, obviously, is to establish new populations so they can repopulate their former range. You can also, and probably the most common way they use this, is to actually move them to an unpoached area. So there are areas that tend to have more human accessibility, either through roads or farms, and that's how poachers can get to them easier. So they move them away from areas that are of high poaching pressure. And this is a transient thing, so once it's sort of this arms race between the wildlife managers and poachers. And then finally, it's to boost numbers in areas. For example, if you have a disease go through or you have a lot of males or a lot of females, they want to make sure that you have a bunch of breeding animals that can increase these populations. And so the other technique is dehorning, and it's exactly what you would think of. So that is a chainsaw on that rhino. This is Kruger National Park in South Africa. They dehorn both of their species. There's a white rhino in there. But they remove the horns, and that has dramatically decreased the amount of animals taken, because if they don't have the horn, they're not really a target. But those horns do grow back. They're made of the exact same material as your fingernail or your hair. So it's going to grow back just like your hair grows and your fingernails grow. So it's usually about 1.5 to 2 years. And again, they have to, capture them and all of this. So it's a really large endeavor. So I wanted to throw in a little bit about the population I work in, because there's lots of different populations throughout Africa, but this is one in Zimbabwe in the Low Veldt Valley. The reason why I really wanted to call out is because they've really been this amazing conservation story. So these are 2 animals that are found in the valley, but just to give you an idea where it is in Africa, but I'm going to zoom in on the valley itself. And what really went on here is that in the Low Veldt Valley, and before the mid-1980s, they were not found there. All of the rhinos within Zimbabwe were found in those 2 colored populations up there, the green and the yellow, and they started reintroducing into these areas. And so the 2 main populations I work in are Bubiana and Save Valley. And so what they've been able to do with a lot of people on the ground, so conservation is a really intensive, you have to involve lots of different parties. Here's just some of them for Lowveld. And what they do is a lot of different things for these animals. They're protecting them from poachers. They're providing vet care in case they get snared. They also adopt orphan calves and prepare them to release into the wild because unfortunately, usually their mother will be poached, and so they take the calf, as well as archiving DNA samples, which is where I come in. And so because of this, I just wanted to end. So this has been a lot of gloom and doom, but there's actually hope with these guys. And so I just wanted to give an example of some recent news. So I said that there were 3 populations. Now there are 4. Starting in 2021, started releasing rhinos into a new national park within Zimbabwe, and they're doing quite well. But what's really cool about this is that this first animal on Sibuya on the left is an animal that was a founder from Zambezi Valley, was brought down, and she gave birth, and now her daughter and granddaughter are founding the new population. So they actually know these animals that are continuing their species and being able to reestablish these new populations. And that couldn't have been done with, again, hundreds of people on these teams on the ground doing conservation. That's all I've got.
What incredible animals. Thank you very much, Dr. Liz. All right, well, we'll move right along. Next up, I would like everybody to meet the museum's research curator for mammals. His name is Dr. Mike Cove, and we're going to learn about, well, again, we're leaving North Carolina to get the scoop on some very cool and interesting animals. Please welcome Dr. Cove to the stage.
Hey, thank you so much. Thanks for coming out. Happy Endangered Species Day. Where's the pointer here? I'm going to talk about two animals, actually. I snuck in a second animal. I'm going to talk about 2 of my favorite animals that are near and dear to my hearts. And I'm going to take a step back in my career path. A long, long time ago, in a lifetime ago, for me, I was a zookeeper at a zoo. And this is Kaipora, and I'm going to tell you a crazy story about Kaipora. Kaipora, I helped raise from when she was a cub, a little baby. This was between 2006 and 2008 that I was a zookeeper. And 3 or 4 times a week, I would give a talk, a jaguar talk, to an audience like this, and I would tell them all about how jaguars are by far the coolest, most impressive cats in the world. And I'm going to elaborate on that, but instead of having a picture behind me, I used to have the actual jaguars right here behind me, Kaipora and some of the other jaguars. And one day in October 2007, I was doing my jaguar talk, and I used to throw in little meatballs in through the fence, and the jaguars would come up and eat it, and they would get real close, and everyone would get excited, and the jaguars would stalk me and I would walk and pace, and they would stalk me through the cage and everything. And at this specific lecture, Kaipora was all the way in the back, probably like 20, 30 yards away from me. And I threw in this meatball, and it hit the fence, and it fell by my feet. And I said, and I looked at the audience, and she wasn't coming. And I looked at Kaipora, and she wasn't coming. So I said, okay, I'm going to pick up this meatball. And so I bent over to pick it up, right? And I'm watching Kaipora. And I'm watching, and you can see, look, I'm shaking because my adrenaline and heart races so much when I tell this story. I get goosebumps. So I bend over. I'm all the way there at the meatball. I look up at Kaipora and then pick up the meatball. And in that second, I was gripped in her arms. She launched 20 to 30 yards, reached through the mesh, and grabbed me here on my chest and my arm. And I'm hopped up on adrenaline. As she repositioned herself, jaguars have retractable claws, right? So she retracted her claws to get a better grip on me, to pull me in to the mesh, right? And as she retracted her claws, I was able to pull away, and I looked down, and I'm hopped up on adrenaline, and I looked down, and my shirt was a little ripped, but I wasn't gushing blood or anything, and there was 40 40 plus people in the audience there, all aghast. And I said, she gets really excited when we feed her sometimes. And I said, please pretend like you didn't see that and enjoy the rest of your day at the zoo. And I ran behind the scenes, and I pulled up my shirt, and I called my friends on the radio and said, boy, I really screwed up. And this is the first time I'm telling the story in a public space. And the reason you've never seen the viral video of that was because it was in 2007, before everyone had cameras and videos on their phone. And it's fortunate because Kaipora was able to go on and become part of the species survival plan. And Kaipora has bred and raised her own cubs in future generations to help conserve this endangered species in captivity. Anyway, I don't say that because I hold any grudge against Kaipora. She was just doing what she did. And I've worked with tigers and bears and wolves and all different other types of large carnivores. And by and far, jaguars are the most impressive. There's no taking the wild out of them. I raised Kaipora from when she was a cub, and she still would take every opportunity to chase me and attack me, and who knows what would happen if she got a grip of me. Now, jaguars are the most impressive cats. They're the third largest cat in the world after tigers and lions, but they have the most powerful jaws. They have these impressive masseter and temporalis muscles, and they have this cool capacity to open their jaws much wider than all of the other cats. And that's because, unlike the wimpy tigers and lions, jaguars use that incredible jaw strength to crush the skulls of their prey. And they also use that incredible jaw strength to kill other endangered species like nesting sea turtles and tapirs, and other armored species like giant armadillos and things like that. And so jaguars have this incredible role in the ecosystem, similar to the wolves of Yellowstone, where they maintain these through a trophic cascade, where they are the apex predator and they regulate all of the other species below them. And so losing the jaguars actually causes changes in the ecosystems. And so I got to, after being a zookeeper, I got to go study jaguars in the wild. And so we use camera traps, things like that. And the reality is I spent over 10 years in the field looking for jaguars, and only after 10 years was I able to get this photo here, this live video here of a jaguar in Costa Rica. And so the threats to jaguars come from human-wildlife conflicts and interactions, where jaguars are feared because they kill people's cattle. And so there are lots of opportunities for research and conservation for jaguars because there's only two big cats in Central and South America, right? The pumas and the jaguars. And so we can actually learn what animal depredated a cattle, because remember, jaguars crush the skull, whereas pumas and mountain lions go for the throat. And so we're able to better plan and manage cattle. And so there are research opportunities where people are trying to integrate water buffalo into their herd, because water buffaloes co-evolved with large predators, and they might protect cattle. But it's things as simple as bringing your cattle in at night can actually have a huge influence on their susceptibility and human-wild conflict with jaguar. But in places where the jaguars have declined, other species have increased in abundance, so things like the ocelots, and then, as Roland mentioned, coyotes expanding all the way into the eastern United States. Coyotes have also expanded their niche in Central and into, at the boundary of South America. So here's the distribution of the jaguars. There's about 100,000, a little more than 100,000 jaguars left in the wild, but you can see that there are a lot of these dark green populations that are known populations of jaguars, and then there are lots of gaps. So the red areas on the pathways there are called biological corridors, and those are the sensitive areas where there's not a lot of habitat, where we need to create forest habitat and prey resources to hopefully connect these discrete populations to help increase genetic diversity and restore those ecosystem functions of jaguars as predators. What's happening? Okay. And then one other species that I got to study while working in Central America and still is near and dear to my heart is this animal here, coming in on the side of the camera trap. This is the Baird's tapir. So the Baird's tapir is the rainforest bulldozer. They cruise through the forest. They eat, well over 100 different species of plants. They're important seed dispersers. And when they are getting chased by a jaguar or another predator, they just plow through the forest. And so they also change the ecosystem in a good way, where they're dispersing seeds and causing early successional changes. You could see they have this really cool prehensile snout that they use for browsing, selective browsing. And this is a relative of the rhinos. And this is just a really cool, one of the largest species of mammals in Central America. And so this is their distribution here in Central America. And so the historic range is all of that yellowish gold part. Unfortunately, you could see they've really retracted in their distribution. And we estimate that there's only about 8,000 Baird's tapirs left. And so this is part of my work with the the IUCN specialist group, where we're trying to identify populations and again help do biological corridors and reforestation to help connect those populations. And there's one of my first camera traps of a Baird's tapir. And at the end, I'd love to take any questions. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Cove. Thank you very much. Oh, man. I got goosebumps when you told that jaguar story. Oh, my gosh. That's incredible. Always exciting to be around endangered species, but maybe sometimes it's too exciting. All right, folks. More exciting conservation science coming up for you now. Our next guest speaker is the collections manager for Mammals here at the Museum of Natural Sciences. Studies lots of diversity of wildlife, particularly in North Carolina and in the Southeast, which includes some animals that you might not think of as living in North Carolina, like the ones that live off of our coast, and that are actually pretty well represented on exhibit here in the museum as well, that we're going to learn a little bit about now. Everyone, please welcome to the stage Lisa Gatens.
Okay, so wow, this is going to be a little bit of a change. I've never gotten adrenaline rushes from the various species of mammals that have chewed on me. Instead, I say words that would be completely inappropriate for this audience. And I'm not going to talk about any of those today. I'm going to talk about a species that is near and dear to my heart, and one in particular I'll try to remember to come back to, because you can go learn more about her as you leave today. The North Atlantic right whale, Eubelina glacialis. What happened? What'd I do? Okay. Okay. So the one below it makes it go dark. We don't know exactly how many North Atlantic right whales there were when there were a lot of them. Some estimates have been, more than 10,000. We can't go back in time and count them. We know that they've been harvested for food and fuel and lots of other things for well over 1,000 years. And especially when European settlers came to this side of the Atlantic and started harvesting them off of our coast and there were no regulations. They were at the lowest, their population, total population was maybe 100 individuals. And when the ban on commercial whaling was passed in the 30s, that gave the chance for the species to begin to rebound, and the numbers did improve, they did grow. And then the Marine Mammal Protection Act was passed in '72, which protected not only whales, but other marine mammals, including seals and dolphins and polar bears and such. And then with the passage of the Endangered Species Act, that provide further protection, not just to the animals themselves, but to their critical habitat, and you'll see why this is important. So this is where right whales occur. And the dark blue shading on the coast shows exactly where they migrate. When they move between the summer feeding grounds in the north, that's indicated by pink, to the calving grounds off the coast of Florida and Georgia, where they give birth in December through March. They swim very, very close to shore. This is where they occur. And so those critical areas where they feed and where they're giving birth, the calving grounds, the nursery grounds, and then their migration routes when they're present are considered critical right whale habitat. And because they swim so close to shore, they are in danger of becoming, coming in contact with large ships. And this happens way, 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 way too often. If you think of that map that I just showed you along the East Coast, think of all the ports where large ships are coming in, one of which has been in the news a lot lately in the Port of Baltimore, the big container ship that hit the Key Bridge. And so this whale is referred to as the urban whale because it does live so close to these large port cities where there's a lot of commercial shipping and also fishing, and we'll get to that in a minute. I love this graphic. The blue represents large ships, and the little red dot is a whale. This is up in the northern part of its range, and watch what this individual, it was a 1-year-old individual, and it was tagged. This is how they're able to do this, make this graphic. And look at just the amount of traffic it has to get through to safely get to its feeding grounds. Go, little guy. I'm going to try to say something funny because it's uncharacteristic of me to not, say funny things, but this is not a funny tale. So what happens when whales do encounter ships or ships encounter whales? Can be immediately catastrophic. They can die from, God, this is a downer talk. I have got to turn this around somehow. They can die immediately from blunt force trauma. They can have immediately non-lethal injuries. And in this mother and calf pair, what we know, and now I've forgotten what year this was. Oh, this year. So this is the calf. It's only a few months old. What you might not be able to see, those are propeller scars. I won't elaborate because this is too dark already. The calf didn't survive. So what we know works. So here's the bright spot. What we do know works is requiring a reduction in ship speed and critical right whale habitat. And again, these are the feeding grounds in the north, the calving grounds in the south, and the migration routes when they're present. There's a lot of communication between people who study right whales, observers of whales that are migrating off of our coast, and people on ships. When a right whale is spotted, it's reported. That's required by law. When they're present, either in those critical habitats, ships are required to reduce their ship's speed to below 10 knots. We know this helps. There's evidence that supports this. The other big threat to right whales is from fishing gear, and primarily from crab and lobster traps. And this is a typical setup where you have the traps on the bottom and then the ropes that go between them, and then one that's attached to a buoy. And as a right whale, this is an important thing to point out. they skim feed, so they feed on krill and small crustaceans by swimming with their mouths open at the surface of the water. They have baleen, so they sift those small marine invertebrates out through the baleen. And so it's real easy for them to accidentally pick up that rope. And it can also get wrapped around their flippers or their tail flukes. This shows injury from entanglement. So think about if you're riding in a canoe and you're not moving very fast, right? Put your fingers in the water and feel the drag, right? So imagine, even if it's something that's no heavier than a rope that's a few hundred feet long, and it's wrapped around your flipper or your tail fluke, and you're trying to pull that, right? And then it can become entangled, and they can die from secondary infection, they can starve to death, they can drown. There are incredibly dedicated and capable people who, when a reported right whale is found with entanglement, will go out and try to remove the ropes, and they are successful. And hopefully the wounds aren't, they don't get secondary infections from those, because removing the ropes is what they can do. I didn't include something up here. Well, this can be maybe addressed in questions. But like with reducing ship speeds, there are people who are working on ways to make those crab and lobster pots that could be deployed in such a way that they're not a threat to right whales and other marine mammals. And hopefully we'll see more scenes like this of a mother and calf. The mother in this picture is the daughter of our right whale that's on exhibit right out here. And I'll cry if I say more. Sorry about that. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much. And yeah, maybe in Q&A. I know, oh my gosh, well, it's so moving, right? Because especially I feel like maybe working in the zoo field, like Dr. Cove talked about, working in museums, like Lisa just talked about, you not only get to know wildlife, you get to, in many cases, know individual animals. I know Dr. Kays has shared stories about individual animals as well on his podcast that he hosts. So the through line, right, of conservation, it runs through all of us in so many deep ways, where we care about these animals in so many different ways. Well, we got one more presentation for you, and then we'll do some Q&A. We'll have a discussion about conservation worldwide. Everybody relatively new to the museum is Dr. Alex Jensen. He's a postdoctoral researcher in the Biodiversity Research Lab here at the museum, and is going to talk to us about some cool animals. We're back in North America for this one. Still, the black-footed ferrets. Please give it up for Dr. Alex.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I'm going to tell the story of the black-footed ferret today. It's a really cool species that lives in the plains of North America. So far, we've talked about really cool, kind of relatively large animals, right, with gorillas also added to this list, red wolves, jaguars, right whales. And I want to show some love to the little guys, right? There's lots of other endangered species that also require our attention and our effort. And so today I'm going to focus on black-footed ferrets here. Let's meet the black-footed ferret a little bit. So they're in the weasel family. So if you've heard of people having pet ferrets, they're a related species, not the same species. Relatively long and slender bodies, about 2 feet long at the max. They have these distinctive black feet, as you can tell, black tip tail, and then also a black mask. And they live for 1 to 3 years in the wild, so not that long. Historically, they were in the Great Plains, as I mentioned earlier, sort of where the buffalo roam, right, the prairie, this kind of grassland, relatively open system with relatively few trees. But unfortunately, by the 1950s, they disappeared, right? These animals aren't that easy to see, so it's kind of hard to tell, are they actually gone? But it looked like lots of biologists thought they were actually maybe potentially extinct in the 1950s. And why might this have happened? So we need to learn a little bit more about their ecology and how they interact with other species to start to understand why they might have disappeared. And one of the main reasons we think is their reliance on prairie dogs. So black-footed ferrets are amazing, ferocious predators. They can kill prairie dogs that are just as big as them. And actually, Native Americans kind of really respected their ferocity and would put black-footed ferret tails on their headdresses as a symbol of their ferocity in battle as well. And so you can't talk about black ferrets without talking about prairie dogs. Let's get to know them a little bit more. They're a colonial rodent that lives underground and creates these really large colonies. You can see on that picture on the right there, there's multiple burrows kind of interspersed across a pretty big area. Those are connected underground. And those prairie dogs make these colonies that don't just benefit them, they also create habitat for other species, right? If you look closely, you can see a black-footed ferret in there, an owl, I think even a rattlesnake as well. And so that reliance on prairie dogs, as I mentioned, was as part of the downfall or the kind of the decline of the ferrets. Prairie dogs were poisoned in the 1900s widely, and then also there was this wide-scale conversion of prairie habitat to agriculture as well. So that was one important piece. The other important piece that partially explains decline is disease. Both ferrets and prairie dogs are susceptible to what's called sylvatic plague. It's the same disease that you've probably heard of, the Black Plague. It's that same disease. This is transmitted through fleas onto prairie dogs and also ferrets as well. And so that kind of explains kind of where we got to be in 1950. There was this large decline, and it looked like they might be extinct, as I mentioned. But it turned out that there was hope. They found a population in 1964. This is in South Dakota, and this was really great news. Hey, there's a population, maybe there's others. After studying them for years, they realized this population is declining, and so they brought them into captivity. But then unfortunately, they weren't able to get them to breed, and all the captive individuals died, and so it was kind of a reset. Okay, well actually, maybe that was the last one, which was sad. And so the government started really taking this seriously around that time. They put out flyers. They said, hey, if you have black-footed ferrets on your property, we'll pay you. Let us know, right? These species are hard to see. A lot of the land in this area is privately owned, and so they really relied on ranchers and private landowners. And this seemed to work. They found another population in Wyoming, and this is 1981, right? And so this is showing a picture of a rancher, and actually the hero of the story here is actually the dog. The dog brought back a dead black-footed ferret to the rancher's door. The rancher didn't know what it was, took it to the taxidermist. Taxidermist took it to the biologist, and they said, hey, this is the black-footed ferret. They went to the property, found a whole population there. And so from this population has sort of started the recovery and conservation of black-footed ferrets since then in the last 40 or so years. So what does that look like? Well, a big part of black-footed ferret conservation is captive breeding. This is showing 6 captive breeding facilities. And basically the point here is to take the animals out of the wild into a controlled environment, vaccinate them, make sure they're not getting sick, make sure they're well fed, and also facilitate them making more ferrets, right? So the point is to create more ferrets that ultimately can be reintroduced into the wild. You can't just reintroduce them right away. They do some preconditioning at these sites where they have them in these outdoor enclosures. They sort of have these artificial prairie dog tunnels made of plastic, but then also put prairie dogs in these facilities and make sure the ferrets can kill a prairie dog and are sort of able to survive on their own. Then you do reintroduction, right? Once you know the ferrets are ready, this is a really kind of a special opportunity for a biologist, having maybe raised this ferret or kind of going along this whole process. Reintroduce the ferret into a place. It's also something they take really seriously. You can't just put them anywhere. You need to make sure they're in a place where they're going to survive. And I think I have a short video here just showing part of this process.
For the staff is very exciting. It's kind of tough to see them go out the door, but our staff are extremely dedicated and they're really excited to think that they're part of a process where they're bringing back an endangered species. Hopefully the release from a ferret's perspective is not terribly stressful because through preconditioning they've been exposed to a burrow environment and wild prairie dog prey, and ideally they would kill a prairie dog the first night.
Cool, that's all we need to see of that, but that's just showing that process. But the work's not done after you reintroduce them, right? You still need to do more work to make sure that those populations are doing okay. There's a couple ways you can monitor them. One I want to highlight is if you go out at night, ferrets are typically nocturnal, but they're usually underground, right, in the prairie dog colonies, but they run between the burrows. So if you shine a flashlight, you can see these distinctive emerald green eyes, which are really beautiful in that top photo. And the other way is before you release them, they'll often put what's called a pit tag under their skin. It's a little it's basically a barcode that's maybe about the size of a grain of rice or a little bigger. And that's actually when they put these rings around the prairie dog tunnel entrances, if a ferret goes through that ring, that barcode will be read, and okay, this ferret's still alive, and also it's using this area of the colony. So that's a couple ways you can monitor ferrets. And so the current status is that ferrets have been reintroduced in a lot of sites. 33 sites across North America. And the point here is to show this is a lot of work, right? Lots of people are involved. I mentioned private landowners are really important on the Great Plains. A lot of the land there is privately owned. Government agencies and lots of Native American tribes as well. And if you want to learn more, I'll leave this up for a second. I got a lot of these photos from blackfootedferret.org, so feel free to scan that if you want to learn more about black-footed ferrets. And then I'll close just by a reminder that, we need to make sure to also care about the little species that we might not know by name but are still important. Thanks.
Thank you very much. All right, well, let me get all 5 of our research scientists up on stage. And if you've got questions, and you're here with me inside the Daily Planet Theater, all you got to do is wave. I'll bring a microphone to you if you're on the first floor and have questions. If you're up on one of the balconies, just wave down at me so that we can see that you have a question. We'll call on you, and then you can yell at us. And then, of course, if you're watching online on YouTube, you can type into the chat there. We're keeping an eye on that so that we can take your questions as well. But I'm going to get started, and we'll just sort of pass the microphone down. I'm curious about how each of your work uses museums, museum specimens, either here in North Carolina or around the world. Because, like a couple of presentations talked about like things that are on exhibit here in the museum that have been used for research. Roland, you had the whole video talking about museum specimens. So since we are a natural history museum, can you give me some insight onto the process of doing wildlife conservation with a museum collection?
Sure, I'll start. So we used them in 2 ways. One was we wanted to see how coyotes had changed, and so where they were initially, and then as they expanded, how they expanded. And so we had museum records that list, have a skull or a skin or some part of the coyote, and it says the year it was collected and where it was from, and so we used those to map that out. Also then with the wolves, they were gone so long ago, like you could imagine some conspiracy theorists would say, oh, there were never wolves in North Carolina. But no, we have the specimens, that are hundreds of years old that we can look at for the morphology and measure them, that we can look at for genetics and other things as well to look at what exactly they were and how they compare with what we have today.
I was going to say, so I'm a geneticist, so most museum specimens, I can get DNA off of them, and there's a ton of different questions you can look at for looking at genetic diversity changes over time. So we know in conservation, genetic diversity is really important. We want as genetically diverse populations as we want. When you lose genetic diversity, it's things like inbreeding and very low population sizes. And so we can track those changes over time, so that can be used to guide, should we move things to new locations to encourage different breeding, things of that nature. There's a lot of different things. You can identify new species with museum specimens. Roland was involved with that, with species that you can see in an exhibit in biodiversity. There are lots of different things you can do. And also, museums keep DNA collections. So we have one here at North Carolina, but pretty much all of them. So when we get specimens, we often take a lot of different types of tissues from them, so like livers and hearts and things like that, and we store them in these really cold freezers, and so they can be available for future studies as well. So there's a lot of different ways that genetics can be used in museum collections.
Yeah, a lot of my work at the museum has to do with mammal distribution, so where they live in their environment. So we use camera trap data to kind of know an animal is in a certain location at a certain time, but then also museum records can be really useful for that same purpose, right? It tells you that this animal was here at this time, and even particularly to see how distributions might change, right? Some museum records are from the last century, right? So we can see how their distribution might have changed from those past records to now data we have from camera traps and other platforms as well.
Well, I sort of hinted at this, and I feel like I should say more about the right whale that's on exhibit here and the research that was done on her specimen. She is a research specimen, part of our collection, even though she's exhibited. But the research that was done on her skeleton was an important part of the laws that were enacted that required a reduction in ship speed. So that's pretty special. But also, recently I was involved in a project where we looked at museum specimens, white-footed mice, to look for the occurrence of Lyme disease in mid-Atlantic region prior to it being diagnosed in humans. So that was cool that we could use museum specimens to look for something like that. And like the others have said, I mean, there are irrefutable records of things being at a place and time. There's lots of other ways. I feel like we should move on.
Yeah, thanks so much. I feel like these folks all covered a lot of it, but one thing that I'd like to come back to is, you know, the original collectors for some of the earliest museums, and dating back to folks like Charles Darwin, they had no idea the technological advances that we would have in this day and age that we can use museum specimens for. So nowadays we oversee the mammal research collection, and we have folks doing CT scans, disease assays, parasitology research, stable isotopes, all of these different types of things to get at wildlife health and wildlife species interactions and diets, and all of those questions can be answered with these research specimens beyond just what we get from our iPhones and cameras and camera traps and beyond. And so I think that the value of our research collections can't be understated, that these collections are essential to better understand the natural world, where we fit into it, and how best to conserve it.
Awesome, thank you very much. You know, I'm also thinking about the ways the many threats that all of the species you talked about face, and even so many more that we didn't talk about today, right? Like even amongst the 5 of you, we only talked about mammals, and there's an incredibly long list of endangered species worldwide that aren't mammals to begin with. But so many of the threats that they face are similar. It's habitat loss, it's encroachment from development or agriculture or some combination, it's road building, it's changing climate. But so many of the strategies for protecting them end up being species specific. You know, we need to capture and reintroduce the black-footed ferret in order to save them. But we need to set up shipping lanes with speed limits in order to save right whales. So I'm curious how you think about, at a sort of global scale, how we continue to get conservation action to protect so many of these incredible but threatened and endangered species.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, I would just like to tack on, I know we have the new Dueling Dinosaurs exhibit, which is exciting and great, but we're talking about mammals here because we live in the age of mammals, right? Mammals diversified after the dinosaurs went extinct, and here we are. So, beautiful species represented here. But I would like to say that Many of the species that we showcased here are large, charismatic animals. They have large home ranges, and again, they all have important ecosystem functions. And so when you have these charismatic species that you can get general public, policymakers excited about and engaged in, then we could protect much more habitat. And so these all are good examples of what we call an umbrella species. And an umbrella species is one that if we come up with policies to protect the red wolves, the jaguars, the rhinos, the right whales, the tapirs, the black-footed ferrets, then we are going to be protecting that habitat and all of the other species that co-occur with those charismatic larger mammals in those environments. And so we're still protecting the Houston toads and the St. Francis satyr butterflies and some of the endangered mussels and other species. So that's where I think that species-specific engagement can be exciting and good for fundraising for conservation, but also that they kind of protect everything under this umbrella. Does anyone else want to say anything?
That was a great answer. Thanks, Mike. All right, and maybe lastly, or maybe not quite so lastly, I'm wondering how you think about the different groups of people that have a stake in these conservation actions. Like there are the people who have a high stake in protecting the species. We care about the species, the environments, the plants and animals that live around them, like you were just describing, Mike. But there's also, you know, in right whale habitat, there are people who make their living crabbing and fishing for lobster. And they don't necessarily hate right whales, but they're trying to live their lives, the whales are trying to live their lives, and then the two sometimes collide in ways that we wish they did not. So I'm curious how you think about the different stakeholders and the different levels that people are interested and engaged in doing this work, and then how we continue to do conservation work with as big an umbrella, as many people engaged and interested in the process as we can.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief, Roland, and then hand it on to you. So especially in terms of right whales, and I'm glad you asked this because there's so much I forgot to say when it was my turn to talk, so now I get to address a little bit of it. So I included a picture up there of marked rope that was part of the crab and lobster trap apparatus. And so one of the things that researchers are trying to do is encourage, actually trying to get laws passed, so fishermen will mark their rope because when a right whale is killed, they can look at that rope and study it and know where it came from. And this isn't to point fingers at the fishermen. But the part that I didn't elaborate on in the talk is one of the things they're looking at, gosh, and it just makes so much sense, is traps on demand is what they're called. Instead of having them connected to a buoy at the surface, they have an inflatable that they can activate and then will shoot the trap to the surface, so there are no ropes whatsoever. There needs to be a reason for them to want to invest in this. And I thought about this when I was driving into work this morning, and I'm older than all of y'all, and I remember the big push in maybe in the 80s, 70s, or maybe later than that, I don't remember, for dolphin-safe tuna because of the way tuna were harvested in these big indiscriminate nets, and because there was this, the awareness was made, and I think this is part of what we're doing here, and then people like me who were so young and impressionable, and I'm like, I'm not going to buy your tuna unless I know you didn't kill dolphins, you know? And so I think that that's a real important step, the awareness, and then the encouragement for the lobster and crab fishermen. The traps on demand sounded great. Yeah, there's going to be an investment, but like you said, they don't hate right whales. They want to keep doing what they're doing and let right whales do what they do.
So I guess I can comment a little on the international side, because in so the species that I work with, black rhinos, I've also worked with mountain gorillas, and one of the undercurrents of the conservation programs there are the people on the ground are the people that are running the conservation, because a lot of these nations are impoverished. They so one of the best ways to motivate conservation is both respect for those people who are, because again, the people on the ground are actually the people doing the conservation. And so, again, like they said, we need a motivation. And so ecotourism is a really popular one when you're in areas where you're dealing with charismatic species. So that's really an important aspect of conservation in these areas where you're providing an economic incentive for these communities that don't have that otherwise.
I'll comment a little bit about large carnivores and livestock, because when you talk about the wolf and the jaguar that we have up here and a lot of the other large carnivores, there's actually, the habitat is not the limiting factor. It is people going out and killing them. And the reason they're killing them is because those carnivores are killing their livestock. And there are ways that you can protect your livestock. So I work with some jaguars and livestock down in Panama, and a lot of these ranchers are letting their cows just roam around through the fields and the forest without any people along, without any dogs. And of course, if a jaguar is going to walk up and see a cow by itself in the middle of the forest, it's going to kill it and eat it. That's what it does, right? And the same thing happens with wolves and in other places where, like, shepherds often are just let their sheep off into the mountain range, and that's what they're able to do because they killed all the wolves. Now that wolves are coming back, like, what's going to happen, right? And so the ranchers and the shepherds, they don't want these large carnivores. They just want to kill them. That is the cheap and easy way. And I say cheap and easy, they're barely making money. Right? It's not like they're making a lot of money, and it's making their lives harder if they've got to pay people to go follow their sheep around, or they've got to put up fences to help corral. They got to bring their cattle in. It makes their job harder, which hurts their bottom line. And so what we're figuring out right now as a society is, are we going to find a way that we can still have livestock and still let those people make money and still coexist with large carnivores? Where do they make the most sheep in the world, right? It's New Zealand. It's places like New Zealand and Ireland where they don't have big carnivores. And so it's happening right now. It's really interesting in Colorado. The state voted, the people voted that they wanted to bring back wolves. They had lost the wolves, so they just last year did a reintroduction of wolves. Of course, a lot of the people who voted for that live in Denver, not out in the livestock, and those wolves are now on the ground, and they've just started killing cattle, and the state is paying those ranchers for the cattle. So this is the state of Colorado figuring out how they're going to have livestock and wolves coexist. And, can we find out ways that we can train the wolves to not kill cattle? Can we find out ways that we can protect the cattle from wolves that aren't too expensive? That's kind of what's happening right now in that scenario.
Wow, I hadn't heard about Colorado. That's a crazy story. And interesting to see all that it's going to be playing out in real time.
Yeah, I'm watching the news on Colorado wolves every week.
Every single week. Wow, that's fascinating stuff. But it also gets at the fact that, like, these species, they're endangered today. We heard about some that conservation actions are making good progress, like with reintroducing black-footed ferrets or dehorning rhinos and that helping curb poaching, for example. Establishing jaguar corridors in South America, that sort of thing. Last question though, what do you feel like are some of your favorite conservation actions or maybe technologies that's happening right now, or that you're looking like, in the next few years, this is going to be the cool thing that's going on in conservation that people should pay attention to? Maybe in their backyards, maybe around the world.
So it kind of depends what happens with global warming, right? If the way the way ocean temperatures went really high last year, if that keeps happening on land as well, we're going to have to start moving species north. Basically, I think we're going to have to do assisted migration because the places that they live now are not going to be suitable for them anymore, and there's going to be some place to the north, generally that is. And they're not going to be able to get there fast enough, and so we're going to have to start loading them up into trucks and trucking them up. That's in the future. That's what I'm keeping an eye on that. And there's the first one that I've seen for vertebrates just happened in Australia where they moved a turtle. It's the lake. It's a small range. It only lived in a small area. That lake was starting to get too warm, and so they're testing it out. They pick some up and they put them in a truck and they drove them up and they put it in another lake. And that just happened last year, so we'll see how that goes.
I volunteer to drive a truck.
Well, from a genetics point of view, and I'll actually use black-footed ferrets as an example, I'm not sure if excited is the word, but one of the other technologies that they're trying out is cloning. So they have actually cloned black-footed ferrets. There are at least 2 in captivity now that are clones of the original ones that were brought in captivity in the 80s. And so the whole point is to boost genetic diversity. And so I'm very curious to see how that's going to go. This is still very, very, very new, but it does hold a lot of population genetic and demographic or population number implications of being able to bring back diversity and all of these other things that we've lost. Maybe we would be able to Jurassic Park it, I suppose.
Something I'm excited about is artificial intelligence, or AI. We use a lot of it in our lab, and I think it basically would help us as scientists kind of get a faster heartbeat on what's going on. So like faster processing data from camera traps, or even from citizen science like iNaturalist. I think I could potentially, and even, you know, it's evolving so fast, there might be applications that we haven't even thought about yet.
Yeah, those are all good ones. I'm going to flip this on its head a little bit, where I'm going to talk about some of the things that I see with us as a society, where we are shifting our spending and thinking more about getting our food more sourced locally. And I think it's important for us to take those types of individual actions to help fight, you know, some of the carbon emissions from global agriculture and raising livestock, and getting locally sourced proteins and vegetables, and that can help conserve habitat in other places, especially where there's a lot of deforestation in places like the Amazon, where much of that is being cleared for raising cattle for global beef production. And so we could all probably stand to eat a little less meat, eat it more locally sourced, and you know, take that all into consideration when we're making our decisions at the grocery store.
Thank you, Mike. I did think of something. So I'll try to be quick. A couple things. In surveying for right whales, because there are so few of them, only about 350, and of those, 100 or fewer are females, and that's a real big deal for the species as a whole, and they're probably functionally extinct already. Anyway, using drones to monitor them rather than, or in addition to airplanes, that's just a bit of technology that makes it easier and more efficient to monitor them. But to tag on to what Mike was saying about being careful about what we eat and where it comes from, same thing with your seafood. Know where it comes from. We expect everything to be cheap. I'm not attacking anyone. I constantly go to the grocery store and go, I can't pay for this. This is outrageously expensive, regardless of what it is, because stuff is so stupidly high right now, but that's greed. That's a whole other issue. Know where your seafood comes from. I love seafood, and if you are local to this area, I would like to give a plug for local seafood. There was a company started by a couple of NC State grads. You can, anything that you purchase there, they can tell you which North Carolina fishermen caught it and by what method. Anyway, there are other ways you can, look up seafood trackers to know where they've come from, where your choices have come from, and you can learn about it. What ones are most environmentally sustainable to eat in general.
Y'all, thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for participating today. Thanks to everybody for tuning in to our program, and thanks for being with us for Endangered Species Day. If you've got more questions and you're here, our researchers can probably hang out for just a minute and they can take your questions. But I'll go ahead and cut everybody, I'll cut you loose for today. But thank you for participating. Thank you for learning a little bit about these, and maybe you heard about something that you can do to learn more or get active in conservation. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again soon from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Bye, folks.